Hi there. This video is going to look at some of the basic key principles and concepts related to the brain that we need to be familiar with. Okay, so the brain is a central part of the nervous system, and it controls literally everything that we do. Okay, so a couple things about the brain itself. One, it has two hemispheres, right? So a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And what you can do is actually you can take your hands, you can ball them into fists and kind of put them together. And that kind of roughly is the size of our brain. It might come out just a little bit more, might be slightly bigger, but kind of roughly speaking, that's the size of it. But then also, if I kind of look down at my fists as I have them together, I can see that they're not connected, right? They kind of touch each other, but they're not connected. That's the same thing with the two hemispheres, right? They're there and they're next to each other, but they don't actually connect, at least not up top. The connection's kind of more underneath. And we'll see that a little bit later in something called the corpus callosum, right? And that way the two hemispheres of the brain can still communicate with each other. Now, some interesting things that we're going to see, specifically more with human brains, is that you're going to kind of associate with all those folds and wrinkles and everything. And generally speaking, the more wrinkles or folds that you see in a brain, it indicates a higher level of intelligence. Right, so there are many animal species out there that if you look at the brain, it's just perfectly smooth, right? So it's indicating a lower level of intelligence. Okay, so more wrinkles, more brain capacity, essentially. And one of the reasons that happens is our brain has to fit within our skull cavity, right? And so if we were to remove those wrinkles, our brain would balloon in size, and our heads would be way too big to help us keep balance, and it's not going to work. Right, so it has to fit within the space that's been provided for it. And so as it grows, it kind of just turns in and starts growing in on itself instead. So that's kind of one of the cool things that we see. All right, now as far as the brain itself, there are a couple principles and ideas that we want to be familiar with. Number one, there's something called neurogenesis. All right, so neurogenesis means it's the creation of new neurons. All right, so throughout your life, your brain or body is constantly producing new neurons. And this is to help replace the ones that we have lost for whatever reason, or just as we are learning new things and things need to happen, we can build onto our brain. We can establish new neural pathways. Okay, so that's neurogenesis. And that concept works hand in hand with what we call neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is taking all those raw materials that are being provided through neurogenesis and actually doing something with them, right? So if we want to look at all the neural pathways and everything with the brain as a road system, and I think, again, that's one of the best ways to kind of imagine that. In real life, if we need to build a road, we'd need the basic materials, right? So depending on what the road's going to be made out of, we need cement, concrete, or tar, whatever you want to use. You need those raw materials. That's neurogenesis. Neuroplasticity is then taking those materials to build the actual road itself, right? So this can happen in two ways. One, we can use those materials in neuroplasticity just to kind of fill in the gaps, like if there's a pothole or something like that, just basic maintenance. But then what we can also do, just like in real life, as you look at traffic patterns and things need to adapt, we can build new roads. We can do that too. As you're learning something new or developing a new habit, we can build new neural pathways. Right? So what neuroplasticity is saying is that your brain today is physically different than it was a year ago. Okay? It's not the same. Now, granted, those changes that have happened are minuscule. You're going to need a microscope to actually see them. But as we learn and grow, as we develop new skills and habits, whatever it is, new pathways are being formed. They're being reinforced in certain ways. That requires neurogenesis with the raw materials and neuroplasticity in order to actually carry it out and make it happen. Okay? So those are two principles that work together that we should be familiar with. One of the other things that we're going to see with the brain that we will be familiar with is something called cortical localization. All right, it's a very fancy way of saying is that for every part of the brain, you can map it out, and it has a very specific function that it's in charge of. Right, so one myth to dispel really quickly is that you might have heard we only use 10% of our brain. That's completely false, right? We're using 100%, right? All of it is vital real estate. we need to use every single bit of it, right? So every single part of our brain has a very specific function that it has been assigned, and it will carry out that function. And so what we want to do is look at what are some of the major areas that are going to be the same across all humans, right? These are the same things that we're going to see for everybody. And then what specifically within that might be unique to you, right? But if our brain controls literally everything that we do, as it does that, there are very specific areas that are in charge of that, and that's what we call cortical localization. Okay? All right, a few other things. So one of the things that we're going to see is that with that cortical localization, there are going to be certain functions that are mirrored on both sides. All right, so what that means is that there are certain things that my left hemisphere will do that's also mirrored on my right hemisphere. They do the same thing, just on opposite sides. So for example, when we look at just moving our body and doing different things, that's being controlled by our brain. Our right brain does that just like our left brain does that. Okay, seeing, hearing, and processing our senses. Left brain does that just like our right brain does that. Those functions are mirrored on both sides. Okay. What we're also going to see is that there are certain functions that are specific only to one side and not the other. Right? So there are certain things that our left hemisphere will do that our right hemisphere will not. Okay? And then with that, what we'll also see is that with certain functions like our motor movements and our senses, everything is kind of reversed. Right? So anything I see, for example, anything I see with my left eye is processed by my right brain. Anything I see with my right eye is processed by my left brain. Right? Anything, any body movements on the left side of my body, so as I kind of move my left fingers, that's something being controlled by my right hemisphere. Right? So for motor movements and for most of our senses, everything is just reversed. The right controls the left side of the body, and vice versa with the left brain to the right side of the body. Okay? All right, so those are some of the key principles that we want to be aware of with the brain. And then what we want to look at next is looking at the specific structures, right? So how is it organized, and what are those structures responsible for?